There are certain silences in life that speak louder than words, and Cindy Williams carried one of those silences with her for decades. From the outside, she seemed like the perfect star, smiling on red carpets, charming in interviews, and forever remembered for her role on Laverne and Shirley. But if you looked closely, if you really paid attention, you could sense that something was being held back. There was a layer beneath the fame, beneath the laughter, beneath the sparkle in her eyes, where a story remained untold. People who followed her career noticed that while she gave the world so much of her light, there were parts of her she never offered, parts she kept hidden, tucked away, almost as if she was protecting something too fragile to speak about. The entertainment world had moved on over the years, new stars rising, new faces filling the screens, but Cindy's silence never faded. It stayed with her, almost like a shadow that moved quietly beside her through every public appearance, every reunion, every nostalgic tribute. For many fans, that silence turned into curiosity. They wanted to know what had happened behind the scenes. Why did she disappear when she was at her peak? What had she gone through that she never shared? The questions were whispered in articles, interviews, online forums, but Cindy never answered them. She smiled through it all, as if trying to keep the past buried deep where no one could reach it. But people aren't blind. Over time, fans began to sense there was more to her story than she ever let on. There were moments during talk shows where her face changed when certain names were mentioned. There were questions she carefully avoided, shifting the conversation with polite laughter. The silence wasn't just a personal choice. It began to feel like a shield, like she had built a wall around something painful, something too personal, maybe even too controversial for the time. But that only made people more curious, because when someone who has lived in the spotlight for so long chooses to stay so quiet, you can't help but wonder why. It wasn't just about gossip or headlines. It became something deeper. People genuinely wanted to understand her. They wanted to know what had happened to the woman who had once lit up their TV screens every week. Was it heartbreak, betrayal, creative frustration, a personal loss? Nobody knew for sure, and Cindy never gave any hints. She stayed graceful, stayed out of scandals, stayed respectful, but behind that grace was a mystery that refused to fade. And as the years passed, that silence began to grow heavier. With each passing year, it felt like time was running out for the truth to be heard. Fans got older, the world changed, but the questions remained. What was she hiding? What was she afraid to say? Or maybe who had she been protecting all this time? Some people guessed it had to do with Hollywood politics. Others thought it was about personal pain. A few believed she had been hurt so deeply that speaking out would only open the wounds again. But no matter what anyone believed, no one expected her to ever talk. She had kept her silence for so long, it felt like a part of her identity. Until she turned 75, and something changed. No one saw it coming. There was no grand announcement, no media buzz, just a quiet message that she would be speaking in an interview, an honest one, an unfiltered one, something she had never done before. And in that one moment, everything shifted. The silence that had lasted for decades was about to be broken. The questions that had lived in people's minds for so long were finally about to be answered, and the world held its breath, not because they were expecting scandal, but because they had waited so long to finally hear Cindy's story in her own words. A story that had been buried under years of smiles and silence. A story that even without being told, had always felt like it mattered. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just quietly sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to really notice. That's exactly how it was with Cindy Williams. Over the years, fans and those close to her began to pick up on small things, tiny signs that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there. The way she paused before answering certain questions in interviews, the way she smiled politely when someone brought up moments from her past, and the way she would shift the topic whenever something too personal came close. It didn't seem like avoidance at first. After all, she was always respectful, always professional, but those little moments kept piling up over time. And for people who had followed her career from the beginning, it became impossible to ignore. There was a certain sadness behind her eyes sometimes, a momentary flicker that disappeared as quickly as it came. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. It made you wonder what memories she was hiding behind that gentle smile. People began to go back, watching old interviews, looking for patterns, and they started finding them. It became clear that there were topics she never touched, names she never mentioned, projects she avoided talking about, even though they were once a huge part of her journey. And what was strange was that nobody ever called her out on it. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was fear of digging too deep, but it only made the mystery grow stronger. There was one particular interview that fans often brought up, a sit-down conversation where Cindy was asked about a moment in her career that had changed her path. She smiled, looked away for a second, and gave a simple answer: things just worked out differently. But it was the way she said it, the way her voice lowered, the way she blinked a little too fast, that made people stop and ask what really happened. She didn't say much, but her silence spoke volumes. That one sentence became a thread that people began to pull, slowly unraveling a quiet story of choices, sacrifices, and maybe even regrets. She had once been part of one of the most iconic shows on television, a household name, loved by millions. But then slowly, she faded from the spotlight. No scandal, no public falling out, just a slow disappearance. And yet whenever someone tried to ask why, the answers were always vague. That in itself became a clue. Why be vague about something, unless the truth was difficult? Why avoid details, unless those details carried pain? Fans weren't looking for gossip, they were looking for understanding. They wanted to know what Cindy had gone through, what she had survived, and why she had never felt comfortable enough to share. There were theories, of course. Some thought it had to do with contracts, or disagreements with producers. Others believed it was something more personal, maybe something about her own dreams being pushed aside. A few believed that she had been deeply hurt by someone she trusted in the industry, and had decided it was safer to say nothing. Whatever the reason, the pieces were there all along, scattered across the years like puzzle parts, just waiting to be seen for what they were. And slowly, people started putting them together. A certain interview where she looked emotional, a red carpet appearance where she didn't seem herself, a gap in her career timeline that didn't quite add up. These weren't just coincidences, they were hints, they were signs. But still, no one had the full picture. It was like looking at a painting with parts covered up, leaving your mind to fill in the blanks. And the more people looked, the more certain they became something had happened, something important, not just to her career, but to her as a person, something that had shaped her, changed her, made her quieter, maybe even more careful about who she let in. The thing that made it all the more mysterious was how gracefully she carried herself through it. She never lashed out, never blamed anyone, never let bitterness show. That kind of quiet strength made people respect her even more, but it also made them ache for her, because behind that strength, there was clearly a story she had never told. A story that fans now realized they had been living beside for years without knowing it. And once you realize someone you admire has been silently carrying something all along, you can't help but feel even more connected to them. Cindy had always seemed like someone who belonged to the people, down to earth, relatable, kind. And now, it felt like the people owed her something in return, their patience, their attention, their willingness to finally hear her out. Not as a star, not as a character on TV, but as a real woman who had lived through something deep, and maybe even painful. All those small clues, those little slips, those quiet dodges, they weren't just random, they were pieces of the same story. A story Cindy had never told out loud. A story that now, at 75, she was finally ready to speak, and the world, after all these years, was finally ready to listen. There was a time when Cindy Williams seemed unstoppable, when her name alone could light up a room, and her laughter echoed across millions of homes every week. She was a face people trusted, a personality that brought comfort, and a symbol of happiness for an entire generation. Her role on Laverne Shirley wasn't just a character. It became a part of pop culture history, something that lived in people's hearts long after the credits rolled. But what most people never realized was that while the cameras were rolling and everyone was celebrating her success, something behind the scenes wasn't right. Her career, though shining on the surface, was quietly cracking underneath. It wasn't the kind of fall that makes headlines overnight. It was slower, quieter, more invisible. A shift here, a decision there, and then another, and another, until slowly, the path she once walked so confidently started to slip away beneath her feet. And what made it all more mysterious was how gracefully she handled it all. There were no angry interviews, no desperate attempts to stay in the spotlight, no scandals to explain her absence, just a soft fade, like a light dimming in a room where no one realized it was getting dark. Fans were left confused. One day she was everywhere, and then suddenly, she was gone. People assumed it was her choice. Maybe she wanted to take a break. Maybe she wanted a quieter life. Maybe she was tired. But the truth, as it turned out, was more painful than anyone guessed. Because not everything that looks like a decision is truly a choice. Sometimes people are pushed out, gently but firmly, by a system that doesn't know how to value them anymore. In the entertainment world, especially for women, age and voice can become a threat. Cindy had opinions, she had vision, and she had strength. But sometimes those things aren't welcome in rooms where power wants silence. There were times she tried to speak up, tried to protect the show, tried to ask for fair treatment, and each time she felt the consequences. Offers started slowing down, meetings were cancelled, projects she was excited about were suddenly given to someone else, and through it all she had to smile, because in that world, complaining could mean losing everything. So she stayed quiet, not because she was weak, but because she was smart. She thought the silence would protect her future, that if she just kept going, kept working hard, things would come back around. But they didn't. Instead, she watched opportunities slip through her fingers, not because she wasn't talented or loved, but because she had dared to be honest. And that's something not everyone in power forgives. There was one role in particular, a big one, that she had fought for. Something meaningful, something that could have redefined her career. But when she asked for what she deserved, she was labeled difficult. And just like that, the door closed. No explanations, no apology, just silence. The same silence that would follow her for years. When fans asked where she went, no one had an answer, because the truth was buried behind polite industry statements and carefully crafted stories. But Cindy knew. She knew what it felt like to pour your soul into something and then be left behind without a goodbye. And that feeling stayed with her. It shaped how she saw herself, how she moved through the world, how she chose who to trust. She built walls, not out of pride, but out of protection. She learned that in a world where everything is about image, sometimes survival means letting go of the spotlight completely. That's why, even as she stayed out of the headlines, the questions never stopped. People remembered her, missed her, wondered if she was okay. They hoped she was happy, wherever she was, because they knew she deserved more than she got. But they also couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. And they were right. Her career wasn't always what it seemed. Behind the success was a woman who had to constantly fight to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And those battles, fought in silence, left deep scars. The kind of scars that don't show up on magazine covers or in old reruns. The kind that stay hidden behind a smile, buried in years of pretending everything's fine. And yet through it all, Cindy never stopped being kind. She never lost her humor, her warmth, or her love for the fans who supported her. Even when the industry turned away, she never turned bitter. That quiet strength, that ability to hold her head high when everything around her was crumbling, is what made her story so powerful. Because not every battle is loud. Some of the strongest people are the ones who never tell you what they've been through. They just keep going. And that's what Cindy did. Year after year, she built a life outside the spotlight, found joy in simple things, and tried to move on. But the truth never really left her. It waited quietly, just like she had, until the day came when she finally decided it was time to speak. Not for revenge, not for sympathy, but for herself. To finally say the things she had held inside for so long. To take back the story that was taken from her. And in doing so, to remind everyone that even the quietest voices carry the deepest truths. When Cindy Williams finally sat down to speak, the air felt different, almost like the calm just before a storm. Except this storm wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, emotional, and full of truths that had waited far too long to be heard. People watching didn't quite know what to expect. Some thought she would offer a few soft memories, or maybe just share light-hearted stories from her early career, but what she began with caught everyone off guard. Her voice was calm, but you could feel the weight in every word. She didn't start with fame or laughter, or the golden days. Instead, she spoke about silence, the silence she had carried inside her for decades. She described how, even at the peak of her success, she felt like a stranger to herself sometimes. The world loved her for being cheerful, funny, lovable, but behind that image was a woman struggling to hold on to pieces of her identity. And just like that, the interview took a turn, not into scandal, but into something deeper. She spoke about moments she had never shared with anyone publicly before, moments when she felt invisible in rooms full of powerful people, when her opinions were dismissed, when she realized that being famous didn't mean being heard. One story she told was about a major decision on the set of her show that changed everything for her. She had disagreed with the producers about the direction of her character, not because she was being difficult, but because she cared deeply. She believed in the story, she believed in her audience, but instead of being met with respect, she was met with silence and distance. Meetings became colder, the smiles from certain people faded, and slowly she felt the shift, that quiet rejection that never has to be spoken out loud but is felt in every small moment. She said she would walk into rooms and feel like the energy had changed before she even opened her mouth. It was like being slowly pushed out without ever being told to leave, and the hardest part, she couldn't talk about it. Not then, because back then speaking up could cost a woman everything. She explained how she would go home, sit quietly, and wonder if she had done something wrong, if caring too much had been her mistake. But deep down, she knew it wasn't her, it was the system. A system that cheered for women when they smiled, and stayed quiet but turned cold the moment they raised their voice. The audience listening to her was completely silent now, pulled in by every word, because this wasn't just a story about Hollywood anymore. This was about every person who had ever been misunderstood, overlooked, or told they were too much. Cindy's story had become something bigger. She shared another moment, more personal than the last, a time when she was offered a huge opportunity, something that could have changed her career again. But the offer came with a condition: she had to play by the rules, follow a script not just on screen but in real life too. No questions, no opinions, just smiles. She turned it down, not because she didn't want the job, but because she had finally learned something important. She would rather lose roles than lose herself. That decision cost her more than just fame. It cost her friends, it cost her future deals, and it cost her the peace of knowing she had done everything right in the eyes of others. But it gave her something better: the truth. She talked about how she had tried to rebuild after that, how she found comfort in small things, quiet mornings, time with loved ones, moments of laughter that didn't need an audience. And slowly she began to heal, not in a grand movie-like way, but in little ways. She learned to forgive people who never said sorry. She learned to let go of the versions of her life that never happened. She even said there were days when she missed the spotlight, not for the attention, but for the chance to connect, because connecting had always been the part she loved the most. She never cared about the glitz or the money. She cared about making people feel seen, feel joy, feel something real. That's what she missed. That's what she had held on to in her silence. And now, as she spoke with honesty, people finally saw her, not the star, not the character, but the woman who had lived quietly with memories that never left her, with choices that were never fully understood. And yet even now, there was no bitterness in her voice, just softness, just peace. She wasn't looking to blame anyone, she just wanted to be honest. She said people often asked her why she waited so long to speak, and her answer was simple: because sometimes healing takes time, sometimes the truth can't be told until it no longer hurts. And now at 75, she was finally free to tell it. Watching her, people didn't just hear a story, they felt it. They saw pieces of themselves in it. All the moments they stayed quiet when they should have spoken. All the times they gave too much of themselves for people who didn't deserve it. Cindy had lived all of that, and now, by telling her truth, she was giving others permission to look at their own stories too, and maybe, just maybe, forgive themselves. By the end of her interview, there was a stillness in the room. No one rushed to speak, no one jumped to react, because everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare. A story not about drama, but about strength. Not about regret, but about truth. And truth, when finally spoken, has a power that no spotlight can match. There was something deeply powerful about the way Cindy Williams finally allowed herself to remember the parts of her story that she had kept hidden for so long, like memories she had folded up and tucked away in the back of her mind, thinking maybe they didn't matter anymore, or maybe no one would understand them the way she did. But as she spoke, you could feel each word pulling those memories back into the light, one by one. And what made it all the more emotional was that these moments weren't full of glitz or red carpets or awards. They were quiet, human moments, some beautiful, some painful, but all real, and they told a side of her story that had nothing to do with cameras or scripts, and everything to do with who she really was, behind the fame, behind the laughter, behind the perfect image the world had created of her. She talked about the time after the spotlight faded, the years where people thought she had simply stepped away by choice, when in truth she was navigating a world that no longer seemed to have a place for her. And the strange part was that even though she had been one of the most beloved faces on television, she often felt like she was starting over from nothing, like all the years of hard work and love she poured into her career had disappeared the moment she said no to something that didn't feel right. And she described how those quiet years were the hardest, not because she didn't work, because she did, but because the phone didn't ring the same way anymore, and when it did, the offers were smaller, less respectful, as if her value had been erased simply because she wasn't in the center anymore. And that realization broke something inside her for a while, made her question not just her place in the industry, but her place in the world, because it's a strange thing when people who once praised you suddenly act like you've become invisible, and no one says it directly, but you feel it in the way they stop asking your opinion, or the way your ideas are nodded at but never really considered. And she admitted that those moments didn't just hurt, they haunted her, made her doubt herself, made her wonder if maybe she had imagined how much she had mattered to people, because when the silence comes after so much noise, it feels like a punishment, like a door was quietly closed behind you while you were still standing inside. And that's exactly how she felt, stuck in a room where the lights had been turned off, waiting to be remembered again. She shared how she tried to keep herself going by taking smaller roles, sometimes in theater, sometimes in independent projects, and how those roles, even when they didn't pay much or didn't bring attention, reminded her why she loved acting in the first place. It wasn't the fame, it was the feeling of becoming someone else, telling stories that moved people. And even when the audience was small, she gave everything she had, because that's who she was. And that passion, that quiet fire, is what saved her. Even when everything else felt uncertain, she also talked about friendships, and how fame had changed some of the people around her, how people she once trusted began to drift away, not because of any fight or betrayal, but because she wasn't useful to them anymore. And that was one of the hardest things to accept, that some connections were only as deep as her success. And when that success faded, so did the friendship, and it made her more careful, more guarded. But it also helped her see who truly cared for her, who stayed in her life not because of who she was on TV, but who she was in the quiet spaces no one else saw. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of her story was when she spoke about the moments she nearly gave up, when she felt like maybe she had nothing more to offer, that the world had moved on without her, and no one was waiting to hear from her again. But every time she reached that edge, something pulled her back, sometimes a letter from a fan, sometimes a kind word from a stranger, who recognized her and thanked her for being part of their childhood. And those moments, small as they were, felt like lifelines, like reminders that she had made a real impact, even if the world didn't always show it the way it used to. And she held on to those reminders tightly, like little treasures that kept her going, until she found the strength to stop waiting for permission to speak, and decided to write again, to share again, not because she needed approval, but because she needed to finally be heard as she truly was, not as Shirley, not as a television star, but as Cindy, a woman who had lived a life full of highs and lows, joy and loss, laughter and silence, and as she said those words out loud, you could feel the weight lifting from her, like all those years of being quiet had finally found their voice. And the most surprising thing wasn't that people listened, it was how deeply they cared, how quickly they connected, how many of them had waited all these years not just to see her again, but to understand her, to hear her truth. And in that moment something shifted, not just for Cindy, but for everyone watching, because her story wasn't just about fame or the fall from it, it was about finding your way back to yourself when the world has forgotten your name. And in sharing that journey, she gave everyone permission to believe that their voice mattered too, no matter how long it had been silent. When Cindy Williams reached the final part of her story, there was something in her voice that made everyone lean in a little closer, not because she was about to reveal some big scandal or shocking headline, but because this was the part no one ever gets to hear, the part where everything has already happened, the fame, the silence, the pain, the healing, and now all that remains is the truth. She has carried through it all, and what she said in that moment was not loud or dramatic, but it had a power in it that made your heart pause for a second, because she began to speak about legacy, about what it really means to be remembered, not as a star or a character on TV, but as a human being who lived, loved, hurt, and grew through all of it. And the way she told it, you could feel she had thought about this moment for a long time, maybe for years, maybe ever since the days when people started calling her a former star, as if her story had ended when the cameras stopped rolling. But now, at 75, she finally had the freedom to say what she had always wanted to say, not just about her life, but about how easy it is to lose yourself in the image the world creates for you, and how hard it is to find your way back once you've been placed in a box labeled with someone else's idea of who you are. She said that for a long time, she tried to live up to everyone's expectations, to always be the smiling face, the easygoing actress, the one who never caused trouble or questioned things too loudly. But the truth was, inside her was a person full of questions, full of dreams that never made it to the screen, and full of thoughts that she never dared speak out loud until now. And as she began to open up about those hidden parts of herself, there was something deeply emotional in the way she remembered moments that had shaped her, both in beautiful ways and painful ones, like the night she sat alone after a show wrapped and realized no one had asked her how she felt, or the morning she looked in the mirror and barely recognized the tired face looking back at her, not because of age, but because of how much of herself she had given away to be accepted. And she said it took her years to understand that it's not selfish to protect your truth, it's survival. And now, as she stood on the other side of it all, she no longer needed to be understood by everyone, she just needed to be honest with herself. And that honesty, she explained, didn't come easy, it came slowly, in quiet moments, like late nights when she would look through old letters and photos, and remember who she used to be before everything got complicated. And piece by piece, she began to rebuild that version of herself, not to go back in time, but to bring her forward, to let her finally speak again. She shared how in recent years, she had found comfort in telling her story to small groups, sometimes at women's events, sometimes to students, and each time she would see that same look in their eyes, a mix of surprise and understanding, because many of them didn't expect to hear vulnerability from someone they had only known through a screen. But once she started talking, they leaned in too, and afterwards, they would come up to her with tears in their eyes and say thank you, not for being famous, but for being real, for putting into words what they hadn't been able to express themselves. And that's when Cindy realized something important. Her story wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who had ever felt silenced, overlooked or misunderstood, and that realization gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She talked about how she had started writing again, not for a show, not for a book deal, but for herself, filling pages with thoughts, memories, lessons and hopes, and how one night, as she sat writing near the window, listening to the rain fall outside, she felt this strange feeling of peace wash over her, and she smiled to herself, because for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't writing for approval or applause, she was just writing to be free, and that freedom, she said, was the most beautiful gift she had ever given herself, and as she neared the end of her story, there was one last thing she wanted to say, something she had been holding on to for decades, but never had the right moment to share, and now, as the cameras rolled and the room remained silent, she finally said it. She forgave herself, for all the time she stayed quiet, for the time she let others decide her worth, for the dreams she let go of too early, and for the moments she doubted her strength. And when she said those words, you could feel something shift in the room, like a wave of emotion had moved through everyone listening, because forgiveness is something we all struggle with, especially when it comes to ourselves. But Cindy had done the hard work of reaching that place, and by sharing it, she invited everyone else to try, and maybe that was the real ending, not a dramatic final scene, or a big farewell, but a quiet moment of truth, where everything made sense, where all the pain, joy, mistakes and victories came together to form a life that was messy, brave, and deeply meaningful. And as the interview ended, Cindy smiled, not the smile of a celebrity posing for a photo, but the soft, peaceful smile of someone who had finally told her truth, and knew that was more than enough.